The mud of the village square felt like ice against Rowan's boots, but it was the cruelty of the crowd that truly chilled her. At the center of the jeering circle knelt a man, his dignity stripped away, a ragged burlap sack tied over his head like a death shroud. He was a broken mass of muscle and silent agony, swaying under the weight of a fever only Rowan seemed to recognize. 100 silver, the merchant barked, kicking the prisoner's ribs. The man didn't cry out, though his breath hitched in a ragged, wet rattle. He's half dead, Silas. A drunkard laughed. He won't last the night. Rowan's fingers brushed the small pouch at her waist. It held 10 silver coins, her entire life savings, her only hope for surviving the coming winter. But as she watched a thin trail of dark blood seep from beneath the sack, her defiance flared. 10 coins, she called out, her voice cutting through the mockery. She stepped forward, tossing the silver. The metallic ring against the stone was deafening. I'll take him. The square fell silent as Rowan claimed her prize, unaware she had just bought a king. The trek back to the cabin was a grueling test of Rowan's strength. The man was a dead weight, his boots dragging through the damp forest floor as she hauled him up the hidden trail. By the time they reached the porch, the moon was a silver sliver hanging over the encroaching rot of the woods. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dried lavender and cedar, a stark contrast to the stench of the slave market. Rowan worked with a focused intensity, lighting a fire that cast dancing shadows across the log walls. She laid the prisoner on her sturdy wooden table, his breathing now little more than a frantic, shallow whistle. With a sharp kitchen knife, she sliced through the coarse burlap sack. As the fabric fell away, Rowan's breath hitched in her throat. He was not the common laborer she had expected. Despite the bruising and the grime of the pits, the man possessed a face of striking, almost ethereal symmetry. His jawline was sharp enough to cut, his brow noble and broad, and his hair, thick and dark as a raven's wing, clumped with sweat. Even in his unconscious state, he radiated a terrifying magnetic presence that felt less like a man and more like a force of nature. But his skin was burning. Rowan pulled back his collar to reveal dark, spiderwebbing veins creeping up his neck, the unmistakable signature of aconite. It was a slow, agonizing poison designed to paralyze a wolf's spirit before it claimed their heart. "You're a long way from home, aren't you?" she whispered, her hands trembling as she reached for a jar of crushed charcoal and moonflower root. She forced the bitter paste down his throat, massaging his neck to trigger the swallow reflex. As the medicine began to fight the toxicity in his blood, the man's body buckled. A low guttural growl vibrated deep in his chest, a sound so primal it made the glass jars on her shelves rattle. Rowan pressed her cool palms against his forehead, whispering ancient cantrips of the Fae healers to tether his soul to the living world. She had spent 10 coins to save a stranger, but looking at the royal scar across his shoulder, she realized she had brought a storm into her sanctuary. The fire in the hearth was a dying ember when the screaming began. Not a human cry, but a low subterranean vibration that shook the floorboards beneath Rowan's feet. Soren's body, previously still and deathly pale, suddenly arched off the wooden table with a sickening crack of bone. The aconite was purging, but the violent reaction was triggering something far more dangerous, a forced shift. Rowan scrambled backward as his fingernails lengthened into obsidian claws, shredding the thick oak tabletop like parchment. The air in the small cabin grew heavy and electric, charged with the scent of ozone and wild musk. Soren's golden eyes snapped open, but there was no king behind them, only a blind, predatory fever. A terrifying snapping sound filled the room as his spine lengthened and his shoulders broadened. Muscles bulging and tearing through his tunics until the fabric was nothing but lint on the wind. "Soren, stay with me," Rowan shouted, her voice nearly drowned out by the guttural roar that erupted from his throat. He lunged. The movement was a blur of silver and shadow, Rowan dove behind her heavy apothecary cabinet just as his massive fist, half morphed into a furred paw, smashed into the wall where her head had been moments before. Timber splintered, and the cabin groaned under the force of his delirium. He was trapped between forms, his face a haunting mask of human features and lupine ferocity, teeth elongating into lethal fangs that dripped with black bile. He turned on her, a snarl rippling through his chest that felt like a physical blow to her ribs. He was a whirlwind of destruction, swiping at the air, his powerful tail end of the shift knocking over shelves of precious tinctures. Glass shattered, and the smell of valerian and crushed mint filled the chaotic space. Rowan realized with a jolt of terror that the wolf within him was fighting the poison with such violence it would level her home and kill her in the process. Risking everything, she grabbed a heavy mortar filled with a concentrated sedative paste. As he lunged again, his claws catching the hem of her cloak, she didn't recoil. Instead, she stepped into his space, pressing her palm against the burning furred skin of his chest. The touch was like a lightning strike. For a heartbeat, the golden madness in his eyes flickered, and the transformation halted. Using that split second of recognition, she forced the sedative into his mouth. The king collapsed, his body shrinking back into a bruised human form, leaving Rowan standing amidst the ruins of her sanctuary, trembling as the silence of the forest rushed back in. The morning sun filtered through the cracks in the cabin walls, illuminating the wreckage of the previous night's struggle. Shards of glass and splinters of oak littered the floor, but on the pallet near the hearth, the air had finally stilled. Rowan sat slumped in a chair, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, until a low, rasping groan pulled her back to alertness. Soren stirred, his fingers twitching against the furs. As he opened his eyes, the feral amber of the delirium had faded, replaced by a piercing, crystalline gold that seemed to track the very rhythm of Rowan's heart. He didn't move at first. He simply watched her, his nostrils flaring as he took in her scent, a mixture of crushed herbs, rain-damp earth, and something primal that made the breath catch in his throat. The realization hit him like a physical blow, more potent than any poison. The tether between their souls snapped into place, humming with a frequency only a wolf could feel. "You," he croaked, his voice like grinding stones. He tried to sit up, but the lingering effects of the aconite forced him back down. His gaze swept over the ruined room, the shattered apothecary jars, and the claw marks in the timber. "You did this. You stayed." "I bought you for 10 coins, Rowan replied, her voice steady, despite the way her skin tingled under his intense stare. "I wasn't about to let my investment die before dawn." Soren's eyes darkened with a mixture of predatory interest and royal gravity. "You have no idea what you've brought across your threshold, little healer. I am Soren Valtor, and those who put me in those chains will burn for it." He struggled against his weakness, his hand reaching out to grip Rowan's wrist. His touch was electric, sending a jolt of recognition through her that mirrored his own. "But my life is not the one that matters. While I lay rotting in that square, time ran out. My sister, Evadne, she was taken, ambushed at the border by men who smelled of silver and treachery." The weight of his words settled heavily in the small room. He looked at Rowan not just as a savior, but as the mate the stars had granted him in his darkest hour. They didn't just want the throne, they wanted her blood to seal a pact with the North. "If I do not reach the borderlands, if I do not find Mordecai Varg's stronghold, she is a ghost." Rowan looked at the hand gripping her arm, then up at the king's face, etched with a desperate, raw agony. The solitary life she had built was over. The rot in the woods had a name now, and it had a king to answer to. "Then we had better start moving," she said softly. "Because 10 coins doesn't buy a man a funeral, Soren. It buys him a second chance." The fire crackled low in the hearth as Rowan moved through the wreckage of her home. salvaging what remained of her healing supplies. Soren watched her with a restless intensity, his golden eyes following her every movement as he tested the strength in his limbs. He was a king built for war, and the stillness of the cabin was clearly a torment to him. "You shouldn't be on your feet," Rowan said, not looking up from a salvaged bundle of dried yarrow. "The aconite leaves a residue in the marrow. If you push your heart too fast, it will seize." Soren's jaw tightened. "My sister's heart might stop beating entirely if I wait for my marrow to clear, Rowan. Every hour I spend in this forest is an hour. Mordecai Varg moves her closer to the northern pits. I go alone. You have done enough by keeping me from the grave." Rowan turned, her expression hardening. She stepped toward him, the height difference between them significant, yet she did not flinch. "You think this is just about your throne? Look out that window, Soren. The trees are bleeding black sap. The game is dying in the thickets, and the water in the creek tastes like iron. There is a rot spreading through these woods, a sickness fueled by the very silver and shadow your enemies are wielding. My father disappeared trying to find the source of it. I'm not helping you just because of a 10-coin whim. I'm helping you because the darkness that took your sister is the same darkness that is eating my home." Soren stayed silent, his gaze shifting to the window where the moonlight hit the twisted, blackened limbs of the nearest oak. He could smell it now, the unnatural metallic tang of the corruption she described. He looked back at her, seeing the fierce resolve in the set of her shoulders. His instinct screamed at him to leave her behind, to keep his fated mate far from the bloodbath that awaited him at the border. But as he felt the hum of the bond between them, he realized her knowledge of the terrain and her mastery over the forest's secrets were the only things that had kept him alive this long. "The path to Varg's territory is crawling with scouts who have forgotten the meaning of mercy," Soren said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "If you come, you are a target. My crown won't protect you there." Rowan shouldered her traveler's pack, her eyes meeting his with unwavering calm. "Your crown won't get you through the Whispering Pass without a guide who knows which shadows bite, Soren. We share this mission, or we both fail." Soren let out a long, frustrated breath that was almost a growl. He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek before he pulled back, reining in the protective urge of the wolf. "Then pack your blades alongside your herbs, Rowan Fae. We leave at first light." The journey away from the safety of the cabin was marked by a heavy, watchful silence. As they moved through the ancient tree line, Rowan noticed how Soren's presence seemed to command the very air around him. Despite his recent poisoning, the forest animals gave them a wide berth, sensing the apex predator in their midst. They traveled by the shadows, avoiding the main trade routes where Silas merchants' spies were known to linger. By the third night, the dense thicket gave way to a hidden rocky outpost known as the Grey Anchor, a neutral ground where mercenaries and outcasts traded secrets for coin. The outpost was a collection of low-slung stone buildings huddling against a cliff face, lit by flickering blue flame torches that didn't smoke. Rowan kept her hood pulled low, her hand resting instinctively on the pouch of mountain ash berries she used for defense. Soren, however, moved with a newfound lethality, his golden eyes scanning the rooftops until they settled on a lone figure standing near a jagged hitching post. The man waiting for them was broad-shouldered and scarred, dressed in the dark leathers of a high-ranking warrior. As they approached, the stranger's posture shifted from wary readiness to profound relief. He dropped to one knee, his head bowed in a gesture of absolute fealty that looked strange in such a lawless place. "Soren," the man breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "The kingdom believes you dead. The council is in shambles. Stand, Aemon," Soren commanded, his voice regaining the resonant iron of a king. He placed a hand on the man's shoulder, pulling him upright. "This is Aemon Thorn, my beta, and the only man I trust with my life." Aemon's sharp gaze shifted to Rowan, his eyes narrowing as he caught the scent of the bond clinging to her. He looked back to Soren, a silent question passing between them. "A healer saved me, Aemon," Soren said shortly, acknowledging the unspoken tension. "And she knows the rot in these woods better than any of our scouts." Aemon nodded grimly, reaching into his vest to pull out a map stained with wax and travel grime. "I've tracked the silver shipments, sire. They aren't going to the capital. Mordecai Varg has diverted them to a fortified stable at the Red Horseshoe. He's not just holding Evadna, he's preparing for a siege. But there is more. Rumor says he has a human partner providing him with aconite-tipped bolts, enough to take down an entire pack." The news hung in the cold night air. The mission was no longer a simple rescue. It was a race against a well-armed rebellion. Rowan looked at the map, her finger tracing the treacherous path ahead. The stakes had tripled, and as Soren gripped Aemon's forearm in a warrior's vow, she realized the 10-coin king was finally gathering his strength for the storm. The fog rolled off the mountains like a heavy shroud, forcing the trio to seek refuge in a dilapidated wayside inn known as the Crooked Hearth. It was a place of flickering shadows and low ceilings, where the floorboards groaned under the weight of secrets. Aemon remained below in the common room, his hand never straying far from his blade as he kept watch for the scouts Mordecai Varg had sent to scour the pass. Upstairs, in a cramped room that smelled of damp pine and old tallow, Rowan and Soren were trapped in a silence far more deafening than the storm outside. Rowan knelt by her pack, her fingers trembling as she sorted through her remaining herbs. The proximity to Soren was becoming an ache she couldn't ignore. Every time he moved, the air shifted, carrying his scent, the sharp, clean smell of winter air and something deep and musk-heavy that called to a part of her she hadn't known existed. Soren stood by the window, his large frame blocking the moonlight, his golden eyes fixed on the darkness outside. "You should sleep," Soren said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to ripple through the very floorboards. "Aemon and I will keep the watch. Varg's men are close. I can smell the silver on them. I can't sleep with the world ending outside that door," Rowan replied, standing up to face him. The space between them was barely a foot, and the heat radiating from him was a physical force. "And I can't sleep while you're standing there vibrating with enough tension to snap a bowstring, Soren." Soren turned, his expression a mask of royal restraint that was slowly cracking. The golden light in his eyes flared, reflecting the internal struggle of a king trying to protect his heart from the woman who had bought it for 10 coins. "It isn't just the scouts, Rowan. It's you. Every breath you take is a drumbeat in my head. Every time you touch your hair, it feels like a brand on my skin." He stepped closer, his shadow swallowing her small frame. The mate bond, which had been a low hum since the cabin, suddenly roared into a deafening crescendo. Rowan didn't pull away. She reached out, her fingers grazing the scar on his forearm. The contact was electric, a jolt of pure, unadulterated recognition that bridged the gap between healer and king. "I feel it too," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's not just a spell or a poison. It's you." Soren's hand came up, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that contradicted his lethal strength. The king was gone, replaced by a man who had finally found his anchor. In the quiet of the inn, with enemies circling in the dark, the bond was no longer a mystery to be solved. It was a vow. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, and for the first time since the auction, the Alpha King let out a breath that wasn't a growl, but a surrender. As their lips finally met, the cold terror of the mission vanished, replaced by a fire that promised to burn down anyone who dared to stand in their way. The air grew thinner and tasted of iron as they crossed into the ironwood borderlands, a place where the trees stood like skeletal sentinels and the ground was choked by a black, suffocating mist. Rowan led the way, her movements fluid and cautious, guided by the ancestral knowledge of the healers who had mapped these woods long before the Wolf Kings laid claim to them. Behind her, Soren and Aemon moved with a coiled lethality, their senses heightened by the proximity of the enemy. The bond between Rowan and Soren hummed like a live wire, a constant low-frequency vibration that intensified as the forest grew more hostile. Suddenly, the wind shifted, bringing with it the acrid scent of wet fur and the metallic tang of silver. "Scouts," Soren hissed, his hand flying to the hilt of his blade as his eyes bled into a predatory gold. From the shadows of the twisted pines, 5 massive wolves emerged, their fur matted and their eyes glowing with an unnatural, feverish red. These were Mordecai Varg's elite, conditioned to hunt with a cruelty that surpassed the laws of the pack. Aemon stepped forward, teeth bared, but Rowan caught his arm. "No," she whispered, her eyes darting to the strange, phosphorescent moss clinging to the rocks nearby. "If you shift here, their silver-tipped arrows will catch you before you reach the tree line. The ground here is hollow." As the lead scout lunged, a monstrous blur of grey and shadow, Rowan didn't reach for a blade. Instead, she knelt and struck a specific moss-covered stone with the heel of her boot. The ground didn't just give way, it exhaled. A dense, blinding cloud of spores erupted from the earth. The sleeper's breath. A fungi that thrived only in the rot-choked sections of the ironwood. The scouts screeched as the spores hit their sensitive nostrils, their coordinated attack collapsing into a chaotic mess of coughing and disorientation. "Follow my footsteps exactly," Rowan commanded, darting through a path that appeared to be solid thorns but gave way like silk to her touch. Soren and Aemon moved with her, trusting her implicitly as she led them through a series of natural limestone tunnels hidden by the overgrowth. Behind them, the sounds of the Varg scouts faded into frustrated howls, lost in a labyrinth of their own territory that they had never bothered to truly understand. When they finally emerged on a high ridge overlooking the Red Horseshoe, Rowan was breathless but triumphant. Soren looked at her, the pride in his gaze so intense it rivaled the sun. He had expected to protect her, but in the heart of the darkness, it was the healer who had cleared the path for the king. The Red Horseshoe stable was no longer a place for livestock. It had been transformed into a cold, clinical fortress of stone and iron. Rowan, Soren, and Aemon approached through the shadows of the rear paddock, the air growing heavy with the acrid chemical scent of refined silver. Soren's wolf was restless, a low snarl vibrating in his chest as his instincts screamed of the danger ahead. To a werewolf, the smell of silver was the smell of death, and here, it was suffocating. They breached the heavy oak doors of the lower laboratory, moving with a synchronized silence. Rowan led them past crates marked with the seal of Silas Merchant, her eyes widening as she saw the sheer volume of aconite being processed. But it was the sight at the center of the room that brought them to a horrified halt. Behind a shimmering screen of reinforced glass sat Evadne. She was strapped into a chair, her skin deathly pale and mapped with the same spider-webbing black veins Rowan had seen on Soren. Silas Merchant stood over her, dressed in a heavy leather apron, holding a syringe filled with a shimmering metallic fluid. He wasn't just holding her for ransom, he was using the king's sister as a vessel to perfect a new agonizing form of silver poisoning, one designed to keep a wolf alive and in constant pain, preventing the shift while slowly eroding their soul. "The dosage is still too high," Silas muttered, his voice cold and detached, oblivious to the 3 shadows closing in. "If she dies before we reach the capital, the Alpha King has no reason to surrender." Soren's control snapped. The sheer brutality of the scene, the sight of his sister being treated as a biological experiment, tore through his royal restraint. His golden eyes flared with a lethal light, and the very air in the room seemed to drop in temperature. "You won't be reaching the capital, Silas." Soren's voice was a low, terrifying promise that cut through the hiss of the lab's burners. The merchant spun around, his face draining of color, as he looked into the eyes of the man he thought he had sold into a shallow grave. Before he could reach for the silver-tipped alarm bell, Soren was across the room, a blur of shadow and vengeful fury. Eamon moved to intercept the guards flooding in from the side halls, leaving Rowan to rush toward the glass enclosure. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she looked at the instruments surrounding Evadne. This was no longer just a rescue. It was a race to stop a plague before Silas Merchant could unleash it upon the world. Rowan reached for her kit, her hands steady despite the chaos, knowing that only her knowledge of the rot could neutralize the silver burning through the princess's veins. The heavy iron doors of the inner sanctum buckled under the weight of a king's fury. Soren didn't just enter the room, he became the storm. Mordecai Varg stood at the far end of the hall, his eyes wide with a coward's realization as he watched the man he had tried to break stride through a hail of silver-tipped bolts. Beside him, Silas Merchant scrambled for a hidden exit, but Eamon was faster. A blur of shadow cutting off the human's escape. Varg shifted, a desperate, hulking mass of grey fur and jagged teeth, but Soren met him mid-air. The clash was a symphony of bone and sinew, a collision of a false pretender and a true sovereign. There was no mercy in Soren's movements, only the cold, calculated justice of a man protecting his mate and his blood. With a final thunderous roar that shook the very foundations of the Red Horseshoe, Soren claimed his victory, leaving the traitor broken in the dust of his own making. While the echoes of the battle faded, Rowan worked with a frantic, steady grace. She had neutralized the silver in Evadne's veins, her hands glowing with a faint ethereal light that seemed to draw the poison out like mist under a morning sun. When the princess's eyes finally fluttered open, clear of the black rot, Soren dropped to his knees at her side. The war was over, but the king was finally whole. The return to the kingdom of Valtor was not a march of conquest, but a procession of rebirth. The forest seemed to exhale as they passed, the black sap receding, and the air turning sweet once more. At the heart of the capital, before a sea of golden banners and weeping subjects, Soren stood upon the high dais. He looked not at the crown in his hands, but at the woman who had seen a king beneath a burlap sack. Rowan stood before him, her simple healer's robes replaced by silk the color of the midnight sky. As Soren placed the circlet upon her brow, the mate bond flared, a brilliant golden aura that illuminated the entire square. "You bought a man for 10 coins, Soren whispered, his voice thick with a devotion that reached every corner of the realm. "And in return, you have given a kingdom its soul." The cheers of the people rose like thunder, but in that moment, there was only the silent, unbreakable vow between a healer who wouldn't look away and a king who had finally come home.